Howdy swim fans! Here with another episode of Whiteboard Wednesday. And on today's episode, we're looking at how to build a training plan. More specifically, how to build a seasonal training plan. And so this video will apply if you're a coach looking at how to build a workout plan for your athletes, or if you're a self-coached athlete looking to compete in your next triathlon or masters competition. First, we need to understand the different cycles that create a seasonal plan, starting with a macro cycle, which can then be broken up into different mesocycles, and then microcycles, and then individual training sessions. If we look at the example diagram here, you can see a macro cycle represents the entire duration of your season. So this can be anywhere from 6 or 8 weeks if you're coaching a summer league competition, or it can be up to 4 years if you're an Olympic athlete looking to compete at the highest level. Now the macro cycle is broken up into different mesocycles, and there are 4 main mesocycles which we'll talk about in a little bit. These mesocycles are anywhere from 6 to 8 to even 12 weeks in duration, and then those mesocycles are broken up into microcycles. A microcycle is anywhere from 4 to 10 days, and that's typically about 1 to 2 weeks of training. Now, the microcycle is broken up into individual training sessions, and as you can see, each individual tick represents an individual training session. So that could be anywhere from 3 to 4 to 5 to even 10 times per week within that individual microcycle. Now, there are different kinds of mesocycles that we need to first understand. So in the beginning, you have the general preparation phase of a training plan. So that would represent this bar right here. And in the general prep phase of building a training plan, you're focused on things like technique and focusing on building a general base of aerobic capacity. Once you have a general base of aerobic capacity, you move into the specific prep phase mesocycle, and so that would be the second one right here. And so in this, you're starting to really focus in on whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish. So let's say at the end of the season, you're focused on a 500 freestyle. That would be different than, per se, a 50 freestyle. And so in the specific prep phase, this is actually where you're going to hit your highest aerobic volume, and you'll start to really fine-tune and focus in your training on your target events that you're trying to be good at in competition. After that, you have the competition phase, which is the third in the mesocycle of a macro cycle. And so in this is basically your taper. So you're starting to lessen up on your total volume, really focus in on your target events. So if you're training for a triathlon, this is where you're really going to focus in on your taper for the Olympic distance or the half Ironman, whatever distance you're focusing on. And then you have the transition phase, and this is what happens actually after the race. And this is also the start of the next macro cycle. So you might start out in a transition phase and then move into your general preparation phase. And as you move through these different phases, there's different factors in this periodization and different things that you focus on. And the 3 main factors that will vary in each of these different phases as you move through one big macro cycle are the overall training intensity. So this goes back to the different energy zones and how much time you're spending in each different zone. So for example, in the general prep phase, in the beginning of your big macro cycle, you're spending a lot of time in the aerobic zone. So you're doing a lot of threshold sets, you're building your aerobic capacity, and then your intensity starts to shift within that general prep phase as you move into the specific prep phase and eventually competition phase, where you're doing a lot more sprint work, anaerobic training, where you're really increasing the intensity, but the duration might actually decrease. Another factor is the load density, and the load density is basically how much swimming you're doing in a relative period of time. So for example, you might do 1,000 meters for every 20 minutes. So if you have a 60-minute workout, you might be squeezing in 3,000 meters of training. And as you move through the different mesocycles, the load density actually changes. So when you're in the competition phase and you're tapering, you have a much lower load density. So instead of doing 1,000 meters in 20 minutes, it may take you 30 minutes to do the same 1,000 meters. And by changing the load density and also the intensity, you can start to manipulate what's happening with your body so that when you get to the competition phase and you start to taper, you have a super compensation effect of all of the hard work that you were doing in the specific prep and the general prep phases. And then the third factor is the load volume. So this is the overall distance that you're swimming when it comes to that period of time in the training plan. So, for example, in the beginning of your macro cycle, when you're in the first mesocycle, which is general preparation, you might not be doing that much volume because you're working on technique and you're building up to the specific preparation, which is where your load volume will actually be at its highest. And then over the course of your specific preparation mesocycle, you'll actually start to decrease your load volume and start to actually swim less per workout at a higher intensity, really focusing in on whatever your target competition is. And that way, when you get to the actual competition, you're at your lowest load volume and you have the most recovery essentially for your muscles to perform. So if we look at how this works on a graph, we have a target competition set 24 weeks away from where we are today. So this is a 6-month macro cycle. And this 6-month macro cycle is broken up into the different mesocycles. So the general preparation phase for this specific training plan is a 12-week window of time. And even within the general prep, you can actually break that up. So you can have like a technique focus, general endurance, more specific endurance. So the general prep is 12 weeks. And then from weeks number 12 through 20, we have an 8-week specific preparation window. And then we have a 4-week competition window for taper. And then we have the 2 weeks after week 24, week 25 and 26 are the transition periods. And if you look at, so our competition target is at week number 24. And we actually have I call it a test, but this is more of a benchmark where you can evaluate where you're at. And this could be a test set, this could be another competition that you're going to, where you actually you see a dip in the overall volume, because you could consider this maybe a light rest period where you're going to evaluate where you're at before you approach the specific preparation phase. So that way you can put in a decent amount of work in general prep phase, evaluate where you're at, and then start to increase volume and intensity off of that. And as you can see, as you move into the competition period, this is where the taper happens, and really the total load volume, as we can see here, starts to really decrease as you get closer and closer to your competition. If we look at the total volume that we're talking about right here, this is on a per week basis. This is weekly volume, and then this is number of weeks. And so really starting out light, this is 6,000 meters per week, and then 7,000 meters per week, ramping up to 10,000 meters per week. And so this is for a master swimmer or triathlete who's swimming anywhere from 3 to 4 to 5 times per week, averaging 2,000 to 3,000 per workout. Again, if you're coaching an age group team, or you're a more high volume swimmer, you might be able to actually double these numbers, and instead of 20,000 at your peak in the specific prep phase, you might actually be at 40,000. This is just a relative scale to see, to see the trends as you move through the different mesocycles. This is one macro cycle, and then each individual training session within these microcycles really depends on what type of event that you're training for. So if you're training for a 50 freestyle, your individual sessions are going to be much different than if you're training for a 1,500 meter open water swim, which is different from training for an Ironman competition. So it really depends on what your specific goal is. And then once you've identified your target competition, you pretty much work backwards from there to build your total macro cycle. And again, the macro cycle could be anywhere from 6 weeks to 10 weeks to up to 4 years. The most standard macro cycle is 6 months to 12 months. So, a 1 year or a half year in this case timeline, so that you can really break apart the different phases that you're going to really focus on. And then if you have competitions between now and your target competition, you can really focus in on resting a little bit to see where you're at and have a test, evaluate, benchmark, and then refocus your efforts as you move towards your target competition. If you don't have a plan, then it's really hard to be successful, so always make sure you're setting a plan for yourself to help you reach your goals. And if you have any more questions, or if you enjoy these videos, make sure to leave some comments, and we'll catch you next time on Whiteboard Wednesday. Bye!